The year is 1945. Berlin, once the glittering symbol of Nazi power, lies in ruins. Months of relentless bombing by Allied forces have reduced vast sections of the city to smoldering rubble. The once proud German army, its grandiose promises shattered by harsh reality, is crumbling under the inevitable Soviet onslaught. Amid the deafening roar of artillery fire and the omnipresent smoke, German women navigate a world turned upside down. Their husbands, fathers, and sons, sent off with promises of glory and swift victory, are now either dead, missing, or returning as broken shadows of the men they once knew. The societal structures that dictated their lives, the rigidly patriarchal Nazi regime, are disintegrating around them, leaving a void of authority and a chilling uncertainty about the future. Their fate now lies in the hands of the Red Army. The fall of Berlin was not merely a military defeat. It was a profound societal collapse. Food supplies dwindled to near non-existence. The infrastructure was in shambles, making basic necessities like water and electricity scarce. The German healthcare system, crippled by the war effort, struggled to cope with the overwhelming number of wounded and sick. Women, traditionally confined to the domestic sphere, were thrust into the role of primary providers. They scoured the bombed-out streets for remnants of food, braved the black market to find essential goods, and nursed their families back to health in makeshift shelters. But the despair went beyond physical needs. The horrors of war had left deep psychological scars on the nation. Many women grappled with the trauma of seeing their city destroyed, their loved ones lost, and a future seemingly devoid of hope. Many homes were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, forcing thousands of people to seek shelter wherever they could find it. Women and children crowded into basements, cellars, and bomb shelters. Makeshift tents and huts sprang up in parks and open spaces. The collapse of public services worsened the hardships. Fire services, medical care, and sanitation systems were overwhelmed or non-operational. Uncollected piles of garbage contributed to the spread of diseases, and the lack of potable water sources led to severe hygiene problems. Even before Berlin fell, the war had severely strained food supplies. Rationing had been in place for years, and the situation dramatically worsened as the city fell. The collapse of transportation networks and the looting of remaining stores left many people without access to basic sustenance. The rationing system, already inadequate, became even more dysfunctional. Ration cards were still issued, but the promised supplies were rarely available. Long queues formed outside distribution centers, with people often waiting for hours to receive only meager portions of bread, potatoes, or canned goods. With official channels failing, a black market economy flourished. Women traded whatever they had left, jewelry, family heirlooms, and clothing, for food. The black market was rife with exploitation, but it was often the only way to obtain essential supplies. Prices were exorbitant, and transactions were risky, as traffickers operated outside the law and sometimes under the threat of violence. Women and children scoured the rubble for anything edible. Gardens, parks, and even cemeteries were searched for plants, berries, and roots. Some ventured into the countryside, risking encounters with hostile soldiers or bandits to trade with farmers for fresh produce. Potable water was another critical concern. The city's water supply system had been severely damaged, and many wells and reservoirs were contaminated. Women had to find alternative water sources, often trekking long distances to reach functional pumps or natural water points. These sources were frequently overcrowded, and the water quality was dubious. Drinking contaminated water led to outbreaks of diseases such as dysentery and typhoid. Maintaining hygiene with such limited water supplies was nearly impossible, exacerbating the spread of diseases. Women had to balance the need for drinking water with the need to wash themselves and their clothes, often prioritizing the former at the expense of the latter. While survival in the city was already a daunting challenge, German civilians, particularly women, faced an even greater threat. For some Berliners, particularly those who had suffered under the Nazi regime, the arrival of the Red Army brought a glimmer of hope. However, this hope was quickly overshadowed by fear as reports of violence and retribution began to emerge. Women were particularly concerned, having heard rumors and stories about the Red Army's reputation for harsh treatment of civilians. The inability to communicate effectively with Soviet soldiers left many women feeling isolated and helpless. Basic interactions, such as asking for water or food, became difficult and could easily lead to misunderstandings. Some women attempted to learn basic Russian phrases to bridge the gap, while others relied on gestures and body language. Cultural differences between the Soviet troops and the residents of Berlin also played a significant role in shaping these initial encounters. The Soviet soldiers, coming from a war-ravaged country with a different social and cultural background, often viewed Berliners with suspicion and hostility. On the other hand, the Berliners, steeped in Nazi propaganda, harbored their own prejudices and fears about the Soviets. As the Red Army advanced, many women attempted to hide or flee to avoid potential dangers. They sought refuge in basements, attics, and makeshift shelters. These hideouts were often overcrowded and lacked basic amenities, but they offered a sense of security from the advancing troops. Some women disguised themselves as elderly or infirm to avoid being noticed. Others tried to flee the city, though this was perilous. The roads were littered with debris, and the risk of encountering Soviet patrols was high. Despite these challenges, some women managed to escape to the countryside or to relatives in safer areas. Despite the pervasive fear and mistrust, some women tried to make contact with Soviet soldiers, hoping to obtain protection or assistance. These interactions were, however, often marked by unspeakable brutality. The most terrifying aspect of the Red Army's occupation of Berlin was the widespread sexual violence inflicted upon German women. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million German women were sexually assaulted by Soviet soldiers during this period. In Berlin alone, it is estimated that about 100,000 women were assaulted, many of whom were subjected to repeated offenses. Some women were assaulted as many as 60 to 70 times, illustrating the extreme brutality of these acts. We were afraid of the Russians. We knew what they would do to us. They came at night, dragging women out of their houses, out of the cellars, assaulting them in front of their families. No one was spared. Young girls, elderly women, pregnant women, they took everyone. The screams of the women echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the horror we were living through. The scale of sexual violence was unprecedented. Women of all ages, from young girls to elderly women, were targeted. The assaults occurred in homes, on the streets, in makeshift shelters, and even in hospitals. This violence was not just a physical assault, but also a profound psychological trauma that left lasting scars on the victims. The motivations behind this widespread sexual violence were complex. Revenge for the brutalities committed by the Nazis in the Soviet Union played a significant role. Additionally, the breakdown of military discipline, the dehumanizing effects of prolonged combat, and the culture of violence pervasive within the ranks of the Red Army contributed to these atrocities. Some women disguised themselves as elderly or infirm to avoid being noticed by Soviet soldiers. They wore old clothes, used makeup to simulate illness, and limped to create a convincing disguise. Women in Berlin quickly learned to make themselves as unattractive as possible. We cut our hair short, wore several layers of clothing, and smeared dirt on our faces. But these efforts were often in vain. The soldiers were not deterred by appearances. They were driven by a savage need to dominate and humiliate. They attacked in groups, often drunk, their laughter ringing in our ears as they violated us. In some cases, women negotiated with Soviet soldiers to obtain their protection. This could involve offering food, valuables, or even personal favors in exchange for safety. These negotiations were precarious and could easily turn dangerous if misinterpreted. Some Soviet soldiers provided humanitarian aid, offering food, medical care, or protection. However, these rare acts of kindness were often overshadowed by the widespread violence. Before the Red Army advanced into East Prussia, propaganda spread stories of male sexual violence to instill fear among German civilians and encourage greater sacrifices from both civilians and soldiers. As the Red Army progressed through Eastern Europe in 1945, stories about Soviet brutality, including murders, looting, and assaults, spread. Consequently, when the Soviets entered East Prussia, many panicked refugees fled westward. Those who stayed behind quickly discovered that these stories were true.
Was running around warning people not to put too much in the wagons. And then we left the house and left it open because it was pointless to lock it.
Renate Hoffmann, the wife of a German Luftwaffe officer stationed at the Greifswald air base near Peenemünde, decided to head to Greifswald with a friend and their children when the Soviets arrived in March 1945. Suddenly, 3 Russian soldiers pointed their rifles at us and forced us into the house. We immediately realized we had fallen into a trap and knew what awaited us. We were separated. They put rifles to our heads. Any attempt at defense meant certain death. The only thing to do was to pretend to be in shock or dead. I don't want to talk about what happened next. After assaulting them, the 3 Soviet soldiers left the house, allowing the women to eventually reach Greifswald. According to this information, 4 out of 10 women in Greifswald, including those over 50 years old, had been sexually assaulted. Giselle Abbé, who was 22 years old at the time, recounted her ordeal in East Prussia during an interview conducted years later. After they were finished, they left me there, bleeding and in shock. My mother held me in tears, but there was nothing she could do. I wanted to die. The shame, the guilt, it was too much to bear. I felt as if my humanity had been stolen, reduced to nothing more than a victim. We were left to pick up the pieces of our shattered lives, without any support, without any recognition of what we had endured. Another victim shared her story. The first night I was taken by 3 soldiers. I can't forget their faces, their voices, the smell of alcohol on their breath. I resisted, but it was useless. They were too strong, too determined. The pain was unbearable, both physical and emotional. They left me bleeding and broken, and I knew it was just the beginning. I was immediately sexually assaulted by 5 Russians. The memories keep coming back. You can never forget something like that. Sometimes, after talking about it, I manage to sleep for a few hours. Then I wake up crying, screaming. You can never, ever forget. After May 1945, the instances of sexual assaults in Berlin decreased noticeably. Women took the initiative to implement most of the preventive measures. For example, a female doctor hid young girls in an anti-aircraft shelter hospital, passing it off as a typhoid ward. Women who sought refuge on the upper floors of large residential buildings generally faced less risk, as Soviet soldiers rarely climbed the stairs of Berlin's high-rises. One of the tragic aspects of the widespread rapes in Berlin was the number of suicides. Although it is difficult to contextualize suicide within the scope of male violence, it is evident that many women chose to end their lives. However, German men were also involved in many cases. If you get raped, you have nothing left but death, a teacher told a class of girls 2 days before the final collapse. More than half of the students reached the expected conclusion and drowned with their lost honor in the nearest body of water. The largest mass suicide ever recorded in Germany occurred in the town of Demmin, where it is estimated that more than 1,000 Germans took their own lives. The retreating Wehrmacht had blown up the bridges over the Peene and Tollensee rivers surrounding the town to the north, west, and south, blocking the advance of the Red Army and trapping the remaining civilians. Soviet units looted and set fire to the town, committing sexual assaults and executions. Demmin's contemporary chronicler Gisela Zimmer, who was 14 years old at the time, recalls, "My mother was also raped. Then, with us and our neighbors, she rushed to the Tollensee River, resolutely ready to jump into the water. I only realized much later that I had held her back, pulled her out of what could be called a state of trance to stop her from jumping into the water. There were people, there were screams. People were ready to die. They told the children, Do you want to continue living? The city is burning. So-and-so is already dead. No, we don't want to live anymore. That's how most people ended up throwing themselves into the rivers. Even the Russians had goosebumps. There are also accounts of Russians trying to stop people from moving forward or pulling them out of the water. But those hundreds of people, they couldn't hold them back. The population was extremely panicked. Several weeks after the mass suicide, bodies still floated in the rivers. The clothing and other personal effects of the drowned formed a strip along the riverbanks, reaching up to 2 meters wide. Many German men did nothing while the women were assaulted during the invasion. Traditionally, this inaction has been attributed to fear and cowardice. However, there might be other reasons for their behavior. For more than a decade, the identity of German men had been closely tied to images of aggression and triumph. The end of the war inevitably triggered a crisis in this conception of masculinity. Their inability to respond with effective violence against the invading Soviets during the Battle of Berlin, their defeat, and their subsequent disarmament led to the collapse of other roles associated with this masculine identity, such as the protection of their families. It is noteworthy that German men only displayed culturally recognized masculine behaviors when they were allowed to collect firearms for the Soviet authorities. The anonymous author of A Woman in Berlin described her unique story. She was one of the few women who could also understand Russian. For this reason, she found herself in an important role as an interpreter and mediator between the Germans and the Soviets. She was tasked with seeking the protection of a Soviet officer when 2 soldiers attempted to assault a woman in the cellar where she and other residents of her building were hiding. Although the officer provided protection, he did so reluctantly. Several times I heard the expression "Ukaz Stalina," by order of Stalin. This order seems to mean that such things shouldn't happen. Needless to say, they happen anyway. The officer tries to make me understand with a shrug. One of the 2 reprimanded men argues back. His face is distorted with anger. "And so? What did the Germans do to our women? My own sister," he yells, and so on. I don't understand the words, but I understand the meaning. This incident shows that Soviet soldiers often used revenge as justification for their assaults. Women were repeatedly punished for the atrocities committed by German men in the USSR. While sexual assaults were frequent, it is fair to note that the Soviet government officially condemned any mistreatment in the liberated areas. Officers and soldiers of the Red Army, we are entering the enemy's country. The remaining population in the liberated areas, whether German, Czech, or Polish, must not be subjected to violence. The culprits will be punished according to the laws of war. In the liberated territories, sexual relations with women are forbidden. The perpetrators of violence and rape will be shot. On the other hand, when the Yugoslav partisan politician Milovan Djilas complained about sexual assaults in Yugoslavia, Joseph Stalin allegedly declared that he should understand that a soldier who has marched thousands of kilometers through blood, fire, and death has the right to have some fun with a woman or take a few trinkets. On another occasion, when he was informed that Red Army soldiers had sexually assaulted German refugees, he reportedly said, "We're preaching too much to our soldiers. Let them keep their initiative." Nevertheless, there is no archival evidence that rape was legally sanctioned. A directive from the Military Council of the First Belarusian Front, authorized by Marshal Rokossovsky, ordered the immediate execution of looters and rapists at the scene of their crimes. Additionally, a Stavka order from April 20, 1945, emphasized the importance of maintaining good relations with German civilians to reduce resistance and accelerate the end of hostilities. There were also several arbitrary attempts to impose authority. For example, it is said that the commander of a rifle division personally shot a lieutenant who was lining up a group of his men in front of a German woman lying on the ground. This effort to minimize assaults was, however, more the exception than the rule. According to a former army officer, "We were young, strong, and 4 years without women, so we tried to catch German women. 10 men raped 1 girl. There weren't enough women. The entire population was fleeing from the Red Army, so we had to take young girls of 12 or 13 years. If she cried, we would put something in her mouth. We thought it was fun. Now I can't understand how I could have done that. A boy from a good family. But that was me. A Soviet army telephone operator recalls, "When we occupied each city, we had the first 3 days to loot and rape. It was, of course, unofficial, but after 3 days, you could be court-martialed for it. I remember a German woman who was raped, lying naked, with a grenade between her legs. Now, I feel ashamed, but I didn't feel that at the time. Do you think it was easy to forgive the Germans? We hated seeing their clean, intact white houses with roses. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted to see their tears. It took decades before I started to feel pity for them." While serving as an artillery officer in East Prussia, Alexander Solzhenitsyn witnessed war crimes committed against local German civilians by Soviet soldiers. Regarding these atrocities, Solzhenitsyn wrote, "You know very well that we came to Germany to take revenge." For most women, survival became the primary concern. Many resorted to trading favors for resources as a way to stay alive. In the immediate post-war period, the distinction between coercion and consensual exchanges was often blurred. These actions can be seen along a spectrum of male domination, where altruistic exchanges, compliant behavior, and potentially consensual interactions overlapped with the omnipresent threat of violence during the occupation. Many women navigated these harsh realities by infusing a sense of romance into their interactions, hoping to escape through marriage to American or British soldiers. Fiction from this era often depicts the aspirations of German women to reach the Golden West through such unions. It remains uncertain to what extent these relationships were consensual. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat, with the trauma of mass assault still fresh, true consent seems unlikely. However, as social dynamics stabilized, consensual unions became more plausible, though complicated by significant power imbalances and the persistent threat of violence. If consensual sex is defined as mutual desire between partners, then some women indeed chose to engage with allied men, motivated by mutual attraction, need, and the hope of escape. Women who fraternized with allied soldiers found themselves in a difficult position. They needed essential supplies like food, coal, and clothing, which could be obtained through sexual favors, but they also sought to escape through marriage. Despite their efforts, these women often failed to achieve their goal due to the double standards of Western society, which labeled them as prostitutes and deemed them unfit for marriage, especially since many soldiers were already married. A married English soldier, for example, remembered his affair with an 18-year-old German girl. "Sometimes I felt a bit sick about the power I had over this girl. If I gave her a 3-penny chocolate bar, she would go almost mad with gratitude. She was like my slave. She would mend my socks and fix things for me. There was no question of marriage. She knew it wasn't possible." In many ways, Western troops were no different from the Red Army. In Taken by Force, J. Robert Lilly estimates that American soldiers committed 11,040 sexual assaults in Germany. However, the German historian Miriam Gebhardt suggests a much higher figure, estimating 190,000 cases by American soldiers. Reports indicate widespread sexual violence in both East and West Germany, targeting girls as young as 7 and women up to 69 years old. Many American assaults were gang rapes under the threat of a gun, with more than a quarter of reported cases involving multiple victims. There were also cases of sexual assaults committed by British and Canadian troops. Even elderly women were targeted. While the Royal Military Police tended to turn a blind eye to the abuses inflicted on German prisoners and civilians who obstructed the army, rape was treated differently. Some officers, however, showed leniency toward their men's behavior. Some rapes were committed impulsively under the influence of alcohol or post-traumatic stress. But there were also cases of premeditated attacks. One such case was the rape of 3 German women in the town of Neustadt am Rubenberg in a single day in April 1945, or the attempted sexual assault of 2 local girls at gunpoint in the village of Isle near Nienburg, where 2 soldiers tried to force the girls into a nearby forest. When they refused, one was grabbed and dragged into the woods, and after she began to scream, one of the soldiers pulled out a gun to silence her. Whether intentional or by mistake, the gun discharged, hitting her in the throat and killing her. French troops participated in the invasion of Germany, and France obtained its own occupation zone. In some areas, such as Konstanz, Bruchsal, and Freudenstadt, French soldiers reportedly committed numerous cases of sexual violence, with estimates of 385, 600, and 500 cases respectively. However, many of these incidents remained undocumented. French Moroccan troops were said to have acted similarly to Soviet troops regarding sexual assaults, particularly during the initial occupation of Baden and Württemberg. German historians from Jena and Magdeburg noted that France was the only country to support the children born from these mass assaults. In other occupied zones, many of these children were ignored for their entire lives. Children born to French soldiers were considered French citizens, and at least 1,500 were adopted in France and its colonies. Some of these occupation children faced significant social challenges, but gradually found their place in post-war Germany. The psychological trauma endured by these women was profound. Many survivors suffered from severe post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, and anxiety. The physical consequences were also devastating. Countless women contracted sexually transmitted infections, and many became pregnant. Abortion was illegal and dangerous, but some women resorted to it out of desperation. The social stigma attached to sexual assaults further compounded their suffering. In a society seeking to rebuild after the war, these women were often marginalized and silenced. They had to face their traumas in isolation, their stories repressed by a nation eager to forget the horrors of the past. The legacy of mass sexual violence committed by the Allies remains a painful and controversial issue. For many survivors and their families, the trauma and shame have been lifelong burdens. Efforts to document and acknowledge these atrocities are essential for historical accuracy and for the recognition and healing of the victims. In recent years, steps have been taken to commemorate these events. Academic research, documentaries, and public discussions have begun to shed light on this dark chapter. However, the process of reconciling with this past remains ongoing and fraught with challenges.